You were never invisible. You were slowly, quietly, erasing yourself in ways so subtle that even you mistook it for kindness. What feels like being overlooked is often something far more unsettling: the gradual disappearance of your own presence beneath the weight of adaptation. You learn to adjust before you learn to exist. You learn to read the room before you ever asked what you actually felt. So you softened your opinions, explained yourself a little more than necessary, smiled when something didn't sit right, and called it maturity. You thought this was how connection worked, how belonging was earned by becoming just acceptable enough to avoid rejection. And yet, something never added up. The more effort you put into being understood, the less seen you felt. The more you tried to be easy to love, the less seriously people seemed to take you. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They assume the world is failing to recognize their worth. But from a psychological perspective, especially through the lens of Carl Jung, the deeper question is far more uncomfortable. What if your worth was never the problem? What if the real issue is that you have been unconsciously teaching people how to overlook you, not through anything dramatic or intentional, but through a pattern so ingrained it feels like your personality, a pattern of self-adjustment, self-minimization, self-silencing, executed with such consistency that it becomes invisible even to you. Because every time you override your instinct to maintain harmony, every time you wait for someone else's reaction before deciding how you feel, every time you dilute something real inside you to keep the atmosphere comfortable, you send a signal. And that signal is precise. It tells the world, quietly but unmistakably, this part of me is negotiable. Over time, people don't just respond to that signal, they organize their behavior around it. They speak over you more easily, dismiss you more casually, assume your boundaries are flexible, your presence optional, not because they are cruel, but because you have shown them a version of you that does not fully exist. And here is the part no one tells you. This pattern doesn't just shape how others see you. It reshapes how you experience yourself. The more you perform, the less you can locate who you actually are underneath it. The more you seek external confirmation, the less stable your inner ground becomes. So the question is no longer why people overlook you. The real question is, at what point did you begin to disappear from your own life? What makes this even more difficult to recognize is that the pattern did not begin as a flaw. It began as intelligence. You learned, often very early, that your environment responded better when you adjusted yourself to it. You noticed which parts of you were welcomed, which expressions earned approval, which emotions made others uncomfortable, and without consciously deciding to, you began editing yourself in real time. This is not weakness. This is adaptation at a very high level. But adaptation, when it becomes your primary way of existing, carries a hidden cost that unfolds slowly over time. And most people never realize they are paying that cost until they feel something inside them quietly missing. Instead of developing a stable internal reference for who you are, you begin constructing yourself out of external reactions. Your identity becomes something assembled rather than discovered, something negotiated rather than embodied. You feel most certain about yourself when others respond positively, and strangely undefined when they do not. This creates a quiet dependency that does not look like neediness on the surface. It often hides behind competence, charm, and emotional intelligence. But internally, there is no solid ground. Only a continuous process of adjustment that never resolves into a clear sense of self. Carl Jung described a similar dynamic through the concept of the persona, the social mask that forms as we learn how to function within a collective environment. The persona is not inherently false. It is necessary for navigating the world. It allows us to relate, communicate, and exist without constant friction. But the danger emerges when the persona is mistaken for the totality of who you are. When that happens, you are no longer living from a center. You are living from a surface that reshapes itself based on what is reflected back to you. You enter a conversation and instinctively scan for tone, expectation, and emotional atmosphere. You adjust your language slightly, soften an opinion, or hold something back to maintain coherence. Over time, this becomes automatic. So automatic that it no longer feels like a choice. You begin to believe this is simply who you are. Someone adaptable, easy to be around, and highly aware of others. Yet beneath that, there is often a quiet disorientation that is difficult to explain. The more refined this adaptation becomes, the harder it is to detect, because it is consistently rewarded. People describe you as thoughtful, agreeable, and emotionally intelligent. You are trusted, included, and often relied upon to keep things stable. But this validation reinforces the very pattern that is weakening your internal structure. Each time you are rewarded for fitting in, you move further away from discovering who you are without adjustment. And slowly, almost invisibly, your identity becomes something you perform rather than something you inhabit. This is the hidden problem. You did not lose yourself suddenly. You built yourself gradually from pieces that were never entirely yours. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to distinguish what you genuinely feel from what you have learned to feel. At some point, the question shifts completely. It is no longer why people do not see you clearly. It becomes something far more unsettling. If everything you present has been shaped by others, then who is there, exactly, to be seen? There comes a point where continuing like this becomes impossible, not because something dramatic happens, but because something inside you begins to resist the performance. It does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as a subtle discomfort, a quiet refusal to keep adjusting in the same ways. You begin to notice the cost of every small compromise. Every moment you override your own instinct to maintain harmony. And that awareness marks the beginning of a deeper shift that cannot be reversed once it is started. The first shift is what can be described as conscious independence, and it is often misunderstood at a surface level. It is not about rejecting people or isolating yourself from connection. It is about withdrawing the unconscious need for approval that has been structuring your behavior. For the first time, you begin to evaluate your choices without immediately referencing how they will be received. This creates an unfamiliar tension because you are no longer stabilized by external feedback. But within that tension, something begins to form that was never there before, a sense of internal authority that does not collapse when others disagree. You start to notice how often you used to wait for subtle signals before deciding how to feel about something. A reaction, a tone, a facial expression. All of it previously functioned as guidance for your own internal state. Now, there is a pause where that automatic adjustment used to happen. In that pause, you are forced to confront your own uncertainty without outsourcing it. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to trust your own perception again. The second shift moves even deeper because it requires you to question something far more foundational than approval. It requires you to examine the identity you inherited, the beliefs, values, and emotional patterns that were handed to you before you had the capacity to choose them. Most people carry these structures unquestioned into adulthood and mistake them for their authentic self. But when this shift begins, that assumption starts to fracture. You begin to see that much of what you thought was you is actually a continuation of someone else's narrative. The expectations you placed on yourself, the fears that shaped your decisions, even the definition of success you were pursuing, all of it starts to feel less certain. This is not a comfortable realization, because it destabilizes the foundation you have been standing on, but it also opens the possibility of something far more real, a self that is chosen rather than inherited. As this process unfolds, you are faced with decisions that cannot be made unconsciously anymore. You can no longer default to what feels familiar if it no longer feels true. You begin to separate what genuinely resonates from what was simply repeated enough times to feel natural. And in doing so, you develop something that cannot be given to you from the outside, a set of values that are internally anchored rather than socially reinforced. The third shift is where the process becomes undeniably intense, because it takes you into territory most people spend their entire lives avoiding. This is the confrontation with the shadow, the parts of your psyche that exist outside your conscious awareness but still influence your behavior. It is not just the traits you dislike about yourself. It is the patterns you have never fully seen. And because they are unseen, they operate without resistance. You begin to notice reactions that seem disproportionate, emotions that appear suddenly, and with more intensity than the situation requires. Instead of dismissing them or projecting them outward, you start to turn your attention inward. You ask what part of you is being revealed in this moment, rather than what is wrong with the situation. This shift alone changes the entire structure of how you relate to yourself. What you find is rarely comfortable, because the shadow does not align with the image you have been maintaining. It contains impulses, judgments, and contradictions that challenge the identity you believed was stable. But as you begin to acknowledge these elements without immediately rejecting them, something unexpected happens. They lose their unconscious control over you. You are no longer being driven by what you refuse to see, because you are gradually bringing it into awareness. This does not make you perfect, or even necessarily more controlled, but it makes you more whole, and that wholeness carries a kind of stability that does not depend on maintaining an idealized version of yourself. When these three shifts begin to integrate, something fundamental changes in how you experience your own life. You are no longer moving through the world as a reflection of external expectations. You are no longer constructing yourself in real time based on what will be accepted. You are beginning to exist from a center that is internally defined, even if it is still in the process of becoming clear. And that is the point where people start to feel different around you, even if they cannot explain why. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, where the work you have been doing internally begins to alter something outside of you, not because you are trying to influence anyone, not because you are behaving differently in any obvious way, but because the structure you are operating from has changed. You are no longer entering a space to be received. You are entering it already established within yourself. And that difference, while invisible on the surface, is immediately registered by the people around you. It is not something they consciously analyze, but they feel it. The absence of need, the lack of silent negotiation, the quiet certainty in your presence. And without a single word being spoken, the room begins to reorganize itself around that signal. Carl Jung described this phenomenon in different ways, but one of the most striking was what he referred to as the radiance of individuation. It is not charisma in the conventional sense, not charm, not performance, not dominance. It is what happens when a person is no longer divided against themselves, when there is no internal conflict between who they are and who they are presenting. The energy that was once spent maintaining that division becomes available as presence. And presence, when it is real, has weight. It creates a kind of psychological gravity that others orient toward, even if they cannot explain why. You may notice this first in small interactions that would have previously gone unnoticed. Conversations where you are no longer trying to fill silence, no longer adjusting your tone to maintain approval, no longer anticipating reactions before they happen. Instead, there is a stillness in how you listen, a precision in when you choose to speak, and an absence of urgency in how you express yourself. And that absence of urgency is often what unsettles people the most, because it removes the familiar cues they relied on to understand where they stand with you. Some people will be drawn to this immediately, often without knowing exactly why. They will describe you as grounded, as calm, as someone who feels different in a way they cannot quite articulate. What they are responding to is not something you are doing, it is something you are no longer doing. You are no longer signaling that you need anything from them in order to remain stable. And that creates a space where interaction becomes a choice rather than a negotiation. But not everyone responds this way. And this is where the shift becomes more revealing. Others may feel uncomfortable, even subtly resistant, not because you have done anything wrong, but because your presence disrupts something in them. When someone who is no longer performing enters a space, it reflects the performance of those who still are. And that reflection is rarely comfortable to face. It exposes the distance between who someone is and who they are trying to appear to be. This is why genuine change often produces mixed reactions rather than universal approval. The same presence that attracts one person will trigger another. The same groundedness that feels safe to someone who is ready for it will feel threatening to someone who is not. And understanding this prevents you from misinterpreting those reactions as something you need to correct. Because what is happening is not rejection, it is contrast. The second external shift is more subtle but equally powerful, and it emerges in how you relate to understanding itself. You begin to approach life with a kind of sustained curiosity that does not rush toward conclusions. Instead of accepting things at face value, you start asking questions that most people avoid, not out of skepticism, but out of a genuine desire to see what is underneath. Why you feel the way you do, why certain patterns repeat, why certain dynamics form in relationships. And this habit of inquiry changes the quality of your attention. People notice when they are being engaged with at that level, even if they cannot define it. Conversations with you no longer follow predictable patterns, because you are not interacting from assumption. You are present, attentive, and willing to explore complexity rather than reduce it. And that creates a depth in interaction that stands in sharp contrast to the surface-level exchanges most people are used to. It signals that you are not just participating in the moment, you are actually perceiving it. Over time, this combination of presence and depth reshapes the way others experience you in a way that requires no explanation. You are no longer someone they instinctively try to categorize or manage. You become someone they have to meet more directly, without relying on the usual shortcuts. And that shift alone changes the dynamics of every relationship you are part of. Because when you stop adjusting to fit the room has no choice but to respond to who you actually are. There is a cost to becoming real that most people sense long before they can articulate it. And it is this cost that keeps them from ever fully stepping into themselves. It is not failure, not rejection in any dramatic sense, but something quieter and more persistent. It is the gradual realization that the more honest you become, the less you can participate in what once felt normal. You begin to notice that certain conversations no longer hold your attention in the same way, not because you think you are above them, but because they no longer feel aligned with how you perceive reality. The need to agree for the sake of harmony starts to feel heavier than the discomfort of standing apart. And in that shift, a subtle distance forms between you and environments that once felt effortless to navigate. This is where solitude begins to change its meaning entirely, because it is no longer something that happens to you, but something you begin to choose, not as an escape from people, but as a return to yourself. The silence that once felt uncomfortable now becomes a place where your thoughts can exist without interference. Carl Jung understood this well, recognizing that without periods of intentional withdrawal, the individual loses contact with their own inner life. When you are constantly surrounded by external input, Your identity becomes reactive rather than grounded. But when you step away, even briefly, you begin to hear something that was always there, but rarely given space to emerge. And yet, this solitude carries an emotional weight that cannot be ignored, because it often feels like a form of separation, not necessarily from people themselves, but from the version of connection that was built on mutual adjustment rather than authenticity. You realize that some relationships were sustained not by truth, but by the quiet agreement to remain within certain boundaries of expression. As you move beyond those boundaries, the dynamic changes, sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that are impossible to ignore. You may find that certain people no longer respond to you in the same way, not because you have become difficult, but because you have become less predictable. And unpredictability, in environments built on unspoken expectations, often creates discomfort. This is where the second part of the cost emerges: the willingness to be misunderstood. In moments where you would have previously explained yourself, you begin to speak when something feels real, even if it disrupts the atmosphere, and you begin to remain silent when there is nothing authentic to add, even if that silence creates tension. There is no immediate reward for this, no instant validation that confirms you are on the right path. In fact, the opposite often happens, because choosing substance over approval removes the very feedback loop that once reassured you. But over time, something far more stable begins to replace it. A sense that you are no longer negotiating your existence moment by moment. And within that stability, a different kind of connection starts to form, one that is not based on how well you fit, but on how fully you exist. Fewer people may meet you there, but the ones who do require no performance to maintain. They respond not to a version of you, but to something that is unmistakably real. There is a truth that most people sense at the edges of their life, but rarely allow themselves to fully confront, and it is this: you can move through an entire lifetime without ever becoming who you actually are. Not because you lacked potential, not because the opportunity was not there, but because the deeper work was postponed again and again until it slowly disappeared from view. What remains in its place is not a dramatic failure, but something far more difficult to detect. A life that appears functional on the surface, yet feels strangely absent from the inside. Carl Jung described this not as a moral failure, but as a psychological one. A life unlived. A condition where the individual never fully separates from what shaped them, never fully faces what lives within them, and therefore never fully becomes themselves. The tragedy of this is not loud. It does not announce itself with collapse. It reveals itself gradually, as a quiet sense that something essential was never brought into reality. And by the time it is felt clearly, much of life has already passed. Because what goes unrealized does not simply vanish, it lingers. It shows up as restlessness without direction, as success that feels strangely hollow, as relationships that never quite reach depth. It appears in moments of silence, where there is a subtle recognition that you have been present in your life, but not fully inhabiting it. And that recognition, when it arrives, is often difficult to ignore. The question then is not whether change is possible, but whether you are willing to engage with it consciously. Because the process you have seen throughout this journey is not theoretical. It is something that unfolds whether you choose it or not. The difference is that when it is chosen, it becomes directed. When it is avoided, it becomes something you are carried through without clarity. There is a version of your life that is shaped by unconscious patterns, by inherited beliefs, by the need to remain acceptable within whatever environment you find yourself in. And there is another version that is shaped by awareness, by deliberate choice, by the willingness to confront what is uncomfortable in order to become something real. These two paths do not feel the same, and over time, they do not lead to the same place. If something in this resonates with you, not as an idea, but as a recognition, then pause for a moment and acknowledge it. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to justify it, but you can name it. You can write it simply, "I am no longer willing to live unconsciously," and leave it there as a quiet declaration of direction. Because the act of naming something, even privately, begins to shift your relationship to it. It moves it from something abstract into something real. And once something becomes real, it begins to influence how you move, how you choose, how you respond to what life presents to you. If you choose to continue this process, do it with patience and with honesty. You do not need to rush toward an ideal version of yourself. You only need to remain aware enough to notice when you are acting from alignment and when you are not. That distinction alone, practiced consistently over time, changes everything. And here is where this becomes something you carry forward. Becoming yourself is not a single moment. It is an ongoing process of returning, again and again, to what feels true beneath everything else. It requires attention. It requires courage. And at times, it requires standing alone long enough to recognize your own voice. But what it gives you in return is something no external validation can provide. A life that feels like it belongs to you. A presence that does not need to be performed. And a sense of direction that is not dependent on anyone else's approval. If this perspective gave you something real to reflect on, stay with it. Share your thoughts below, not for agreement, but for clarity. And if you are ready to go deeper into this kind of exploration, you already know the next step. Stay here. Continue the journey, and allow yourself the time to become who you were always meant to be.